Humanitarian Aid, and I will let you guys get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Jesse Papa.
My name is Wyatt Harris.
My name is Alyssa Sandoval, and today we are going to be covering the effect of banking access on humanitarian aid disbursement. So, humanitarian aid depends on whether individuals can safely receive, store, and transfer money. And it can be delivered in different forms like cash transfers. So, many countries have limited access to formal banking services, and because of this, it makes it harder for them to receive aid. This can lead to things like barriers to cash transfers, emergency relief, and government assistance. So, when people have access to financial accounts, aid can be delivered more securely and at a lower cost, according to World Bank. A great example of this is in Kenya, where aid is dispersed through mobile banking apps. One of them, I believe, is called M-Pesa, where the recipient can receive aid a lot quicker. And this leads to our question: how does the percentage of adults with financial accounts influence humanitarian aid disbursement? So, about 1.4 billion individuals worldwide lack access to formal banking systems. And this is not just an inconvenience, this is a real issue. This leaves people vulnerable, causing them to face difficult things like food insecurity, untreated illness, and limited access to basic necessities. So, we believe that if banking access improves aid delivery, it should increase financial accounts, and it may strengthen humanitarian response and reduce exclusion. So this led us to our prediction that higher access to financial accounts will increase aid disbursement by 10%. So our research examines how financial accounts influence humanitarian aid disbursement across countries, and we do this by analyzing the percentage of people with financial accounts. So to better understand these models, we divided them into three different models: our combined model, which has all countries involved, our low-income country model, and our high-income country model. Within our combined model, we find that financial accounts positively affect humanitarian aid, and countries with greater banking access are going to receive stronger aid flows. And then GDP per capita shows a negative relationship with aid, and then corruption reduces aid as well. And then we find in our low income countries, financial accounts are not significant, and GDP and corruption strongly influence the aid that they need. And then in higher income countries, we find that GDP does not matter. So financial accounts increase aid, corruption reduces it. So greater banking access with countries that have greater banking access, they're going to be able to receive and disperse aid a lot more efficiently. So our economic theory: if individuals do not have formal financial accounts, then aid delivery is going to be slower and less efficient. So our deduction off of this is that if banking access increases, humanitarian aid should improve because governments and aid organizations can distribute support a lot more efficiently. This will ultimately, in the long run, reduce fraud, delays, administrative costs, and exclusion errors. So our study uses cross-country panel data starting from 2011 to 2024. We focus on the countries with available reporting for the percentage of people that have bank accounts, US humanitarian aid disbursement, GDP per capita, and corruption levels. Again, we then split this sample into two groups, which are our low income and our high income countries. And then we examine these relationships and their development across levels. So we were able to find related research that also supports what we are researching as well. Dr. Carol Crawley found that direct payments and unemployment benefits are more effective than payroll tax cuts. And this is because they reach people that have greater financial need. When you reach people that have greater financial need, it'll increase spending because they're going to have to spend that money a lot quicker. And now to Jesse with our data sources.
So we have four main data sources. We have US aid disbursement levels, and this gives us a monetary value on the actual aid that's dispersed throughout these countries. We then move on to the World Bank Index, which gives us the percentage of adults with financial accounts in the countries observed. And then we go to the World Bank GDP. We use per capita to control for any skewing data. And then we go to the Transparency International. This organization reads levels of perceived corruption on these countries, which is very important because ultimately this is how the donors are going to look at these countries and will affect the amount of aid that they give. This moves on to our variables. Our independent variable will be percentage of adults with financial accounts, dependent being humanitarian aid disbursement, and we're controlling for GDP per capita and corruption. We can see our summary statistics. We see that financial accounts in the observed countries sit around 54% of the population being having financial accounts. And financial account 2 is just a prediction model that allows us to see fill in the gaps and it's a robust model that confirms our original findings. And the corruption sits about 2.5, mildly corrupt, with 4 being the max. And the GDP per capita is sitting around 11,713, which leads us into our low summary statistics, and that's going to be financial accounts drop below the average at 42% of the population being having financial accounts. GDP per capita shooting all the way down to $4,200 per person, and then corruption shooting up to 3, showing that these lower income countries do not have strong financial institutions in place, which will lead us into our high income summary statistics. So the financial accounts shoot all the way up to 87% on average of the population having financial accounts. GDP per capita going up to $32,000 per person, and corruption dropping down all the way to 1.3, showing that they have strong financial institutions in place, which will lead us into our regression model. Um, uh, Firstly, we're going to take the natural logarithm of humanitarian aid disbursements, with I being countries and T being years. We then move on to the variables, financial accounts, GDP per capita, and corruption, with holding year fixed effects constant and country fixed effects, acknowledging that some things happen along the road, conflicts, and stuff like COVID, so we can control for that skew, and then the epsilon of the mean zero error term, which will lead us into our overall regression results. This is the whole model group together. And we have the financial accounts sitting at 1.3 coefficient, meaning if you raise your financial accounts by 1%, you'll receive 1.3% back on humanitarian aid. Statistically significant at 95. GDP per capita is having an inverse relationship, even though it's relatively small. Remember, we're dealing with millions and billions, so this does have a large effect whenever it does go up. And corruption having a more significant effect at 3% on the inverse relationship, again, statistically significant. Going into our low and high income results, and this is where we really see the issues. We see that financial accounts hold no significant value whatsoever in these low income countries, showing if even if you do increase your bank account percentage, you don't really receive anything back because you don't have the institutions in place to distribute the aid properly to your citizens. GDP per capita holding significant at the inverse, and then corruption holding 1 at the baseline, going up. We can see that it has a very strong coefficient and statistically significant, showing if these lower income countries do increase their corruption, they receive significantly less aid. And then we almost see the flip side on the higher 50%, showing that if you increase financial accounts in your higher income country, you receive 4% back on humanitarian aid. Uh, Whenever these countries they receive the aid, they have the financial institutions, they have banks, they have everything, and they can effectively distribute it to their population, showing that corruption does have more of a significance, and they lose significantly more money. But we don't have the fourth corruption because not enough of these countries in the higher income have enough corruption in them to run the regression on the fourth one.
All right, so what could be some potential policy solutions for this banking access issue? So a good one right here is account mandates. So this was a big problem in India, as an example, where banks were denying people access to financial accounts simply because they didn't have enough money. So an account mandate could be a potential solution because it offers no frills or zero balance accounts to all citizens, regardless of income, lowering barriers to financial account access. Another one is government to person mandates. So examples of countries that did similar things were Brazil, where it's just a simple app that you can log into with your tax ID number, and it makes it very simplistic and easy to set up a bank account, kind of just over the phone or with some like the most bare bones basic government identification that is offered in those countries. So just overall making digital banking access easier, quicker, and lowering those barriers, right? Next, we have agent banking. So agent banking was something that has been implemented in places like Kenya, where instead of opening up a physical branch location of a bank in places that are more harder to reach, you have smaller kiosks or smaller stores in these harder to reach places or small towns that can act as those intermediaries, so that you can go to like a local store that's not an official bank branch, and you can still do the basic transactions like withdrawal and deposit through those agent banking intermediaries.
So small. We see that this is the lower 50% when we apply these baking policies. So for the lower 50%, we can see that the original value before, and then pre-baking policy and post-baking policy. What this means is, with these baking policies in place that we have shown as an example, whenever you couple this with financial account increase, instead of barely getting anything at a no significance, it turns very significant, and you almost mimic the financial institutions in place in the higher 50%, showing that these financial policies are able to more effectively distribute aid to the people at a much higher rate than normally on the lower end.
So over here we have this plotted. So this is the US aid disbursements on the y-axis, the log of them, with the financial account access on the x-axis. This is controlled for year and country fixed effects. And we can see that on the top 50% of GDP per capita countries, we have a slight positive trend line. And then remember that in the bottom 50% of GDP per capita countries, we did not observe a statistically significant relationship here, and the trend line is pretty much completely flat. So what were some of the kind of limitations of our data in our study? So initially we set out to study what are the rates of access to identification on humanitarian aid distribution. However, the panel data for multiple years in general, the ID data was just not conclusive. It was limited. There wasn't enough values. So it made the data set not really viable and not really usable. So instead we used bank account, financial account access as a proxy or a substitute for this identification data, ID access data, to then serve as a measure of institutional capacity, so then we could see kind of the effects. Because we know that in order to open a bank account, you still need an ID in the first place. So here are our do files. This is how we made the regression. And so what can we kind of conclude from this analysis? So bank account access does have a positive and statistically significant effect on humanitarian aid when we look at the full sample together. GDP per capita is not necessarily a strong predictor of aid across models, and corruption does in turn significantly reduces aid flows in the combined model. However, in the low income model, bank account access is not statistically significant, and aid is more strongly influenced by GDP and corruption, which do show a negative relationship with aid. When we look at the top 50% or the higher income model, we do see that bank account access has a significant positive effect, while corruption reduces aid and GDP does not turn out to be significant. So overall, we can conclude that the drivers of aid do differ by income level, and financial account access does matter more in the higher income countries than the lower income countries. And we do find out that economic conditions end up playing a larger role in the disbursement and allocation of humanitarian aid across the lower income countries.
Thank you, everybody. We're now open to questions.